The office was too quiet for a Monday morning. My briefcase sat open on the desk, the leather creased from years of travel, contracts, and late nights in boardrooms that smelled of cold coffee and old ambition. I placed each item inside with slow precision. Pen, notebook, reading glasses, the small brass paperweight my daughter gave me on my 50th birthday. The silence pressed in from every corner of the glass tower, broken only by the hum of the HVAC and the faint echo of laughter drifting in from the conference room down the hall. That laughter wasn't mine anymore. It never would be again. My name is Robert Keller. I'm 59 years old, and until 15 minutes ago, I was Chief Operations Officer of Harrington Global Industries, one of the largest infrastructure and logistics firms in North America. For 32 years, I'd been the ballast that kept this company from capsizing during storms, 3 recessions, 1 near bankruptcy, 2 hostile takeovers. When markets collapsed, I steadied the ship. When competitors clawed at our contracts, I locked in deals worth billions. My loyalty was measured in signed agreements and survival. And this morning, none of it mattered. She sat across from me when it happened. Claire Harrington, 26, the founder's only child, freshly installed as CEO after her father's sudden stroke. Her hair was styled sharp, her nails painted like lacquered blades, and her voice was clipped with the certainty of someone who'd never been tested. Beside her lounged her college roommate, the newly appointed Chief Vibes Officer, whatever that meant. He had sneakers on, an ironic t-shirt under a blazer 2 sizes too small, and a smug grin as he sipped cold brew from a mason jar. Claire leaned back, folded her arms, and said it like a casual insult tossed over brunch. "You're stuck in the past, Robert. We need new blood, a new vision. Thank you for your service, but it's time to move forward." Her friend snickered. "Economics is all about vibes now, man, not spreadsheets." I could have laughed. I could have reminded them that without my contracts, their paychecks wouldn't clear. I could have listed the crises I carried on my shoulders while they were still cramming for midterms. But I didn't. I closed the latch on my briefcase, nodded once, and stood. My silence seemed to confuse them, as though they expected groveling or rage. They didn't know me at all. The hallway stretched long and empty as I walked toward the elevators. My footsteps were steady, my grip firm around the handle of my case. I felt nothing. No anger, no grief. Just a hollow clarity, like the air right before a thunderstorm. But as I reached the far end, just before the frosted glass doors, I paused. Their voices carried through the thin walls, careless, unguarded. "Once the old man's out, we'll gut his pet projects," Claire said. Her tone was sharp now, stripped of the polished performance she used in meetings. "Sell the patents, strip it for parts, and pivot hard into green tech branding. The board won't even blink once we show them the deck." Her roommate laughed, a low, lazy sound. The guy never saw it coming. He probably still thinks loyalty means something. I stood there, one hand hovering near the door handle, the other tightening on the leather strap of my case. The words landed heavier than the dismissal itself. Fired was one thing, betrayed was another. Those projects they mocked weren't hobbies. They were the backbone of Harrington Global's long-term survival. Patents tied to supply chain innovations, energy-efficient freight corridors, exclusive international agreements that had taken years to stitch together. They thought they could dismantle it, like pulling Jenga blocks. They didn't realize those blocks were load-bearing. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep walking, to let the creak of the elevator doors mask the echo of their voices in my head. My face was calm, when the mirrored steel closed around me. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was calculation. I had built this empire with blood and bone, not just mine, but the hundreds of employees who trusted me, who followed me when the economy burned and competitors circled like vultures. I'd stood in rooms where banks threatened foreclosure and convinced them to double down instead. I'd negotiated contracts that rival nations tried to steal out from under us. And through it all, I had remained silent when silence mattered most. Let the other side talk. Let them reveal themselves. Let them think they'd already won. The elevator descended, each floor passing like a metronome. My reflection stared back, lined face, gray at the temples, eyes that had watched too many storms roll in. They thought I was finished, that I'd fade into the quiet of retirement with a watch and a handshake. They had no idea what silence could hide. When the doors slid open onto the marble lobby, I stepped out into the cool light. Receptionists glanced up, curious, but said nothing. I walked toward the revolving doors and pushed through into the bright morning air. The city roared around me, horns chatter, the low growl of buses. Life went on. To anyone else, I was just another man leaving an office with a briefcase in hand. But beneath the surface, something old had awakened. I didn't rage. I didn't plan. Not yet. I simply walked, letting the noise of the streets drown out the memory of their laughter. But the words stayed. Gut his projects, sell the patents, strip it for parts. They thought they'd cut me loose. What they'd done was sharpen me. And when the time came, they would learn what happens when you fire the man who knows where every bone is buried. The day I walked out of Harrington Global's tower, I didn't go home. Home was too quiet, too honest. Instead, I drove across the city, past the riverside condos and glittering tech startups, to a nondescript brick building that hadn't been updated since the 70s. The paint was peeling, the elevator groaned like it wanted to die, and the hallways smelled faintly of dust and ink. My office was on the top floor, a space I'd leased years ago under a shell company no one connected to me. To most, it looked like an accountant's closet, filing cabinets, cheap blinds, fluorescent lights. But behind a second locked door was my sanctuary. Inside, the hum of servers filled the room with a low, steady vibration. Cables ran like veins into a row of machines stacked against the wall, each one humming with power. A steel desk sat at the center, lined with monitors that could reach into corners of the company no executive had ever seen. This was the real Harrington Global, stripped of branding and marketing fluff. The arteries of contracts, the lifeblood of client trust, the coded pathways of supply chains that had taken me decades to weave. I had built it piece by piece, burying redundancies so deep that even the board didn't know which switches mattered. They thought I was just a COO. They had no idea I was also the architect of its spine. I powered up the main terminal and leaned back as the screens came alive. One monitor streamed contract expirations. Another tracked pending receivables from clients across 3 continents. A third displayed vendor obligations, timelines, penalties, clauses sharp enough to bleed anyone reckless enough to mishandle them. And in the corner of it all was my personal index, a web of trust I'd cultivated over 30 years. I didn't just sign deals. I built relationships that could outlast recessions, collapses, even betrayal. My mind slipped back to the first time I realized silence was stronger than force. It was 1991. The economy was cracking, banks folding, customers defaulting on payments. I was a young manager then, full of adrenaline, desperate to prove myself. A competitor tried to poach one of our biggest contracts, promising lower rates, faster delivery. My instinct was to fight loud, make threats, call lawyers. But my mentor at the time, a man who'd survived 2 decades of backroom brawls, stopped me. "Don't shout," he said. "Listen. They'll show you where the cracks are if you let them talk." So I did. I waited in silence, tracked their offers, watched their arrogance slip into overpromises. Within months, they'd cornered themselves, bleeding cash while I swooped in quietly, with a steady hand and a patient smile. That client stayed with us another decade. I never forgot the lesson. You win by listening, by waiting, by letting your enemy walk straight into their own trap. Now, years later, I sat surrounded by the ghosts of every crisis I'd endured. The dot-com implosion, the housing collapse, the pandemic supply chain freeze. Each one had left scars, but scars are just records of survival. I carried mine like a ledger. Claire and her chief vibes officer had none. They mistook a bull market for brilliance. They thought buzzwords could replace ballast. On my screens, I watched their first moves. They announced a strategic pivot to the press. Phrases like disruption, green synergy, market vibration. Investors clapped like seals at a circus. Behind the curtain, I saw the truth. They were shutting down the projects that kept us stable, bleeding out the foundations in favor of flashy but hollow initiatives. Liquidity dipped with every cancellation. Vendor penalties ticked higher as contracts were broken without a thought. A slow leak had begun, one only I could see. I sipped black coffee from a chipped mug and tracked the numbers in silence. Each wrong step they took felt like another brick tumbling loose from the foundation I'd spent decades pouring. I could have intervened. I could have called a client, pulled a clause, frozen a line of credit. With a few keystrokes, I could have detonated their vision before it left the runway. But I didn't. Not yet. Because silence has weight. Pressure builds in the dark, unseen, until it's unbearable. And when it finally breaks, it doesn't trickle. It floods. So I sat there, night after night, watching them stumble in their borrowed shoes, mistaking arrogance for innovation. Each press release, each smug interview, each hollow victory pulled them closer to the cliff. My hands hovered over the keys, itching to strike, but I held them steady. Timing was everything. Let them talk. Let them brag. Let them cut their own lifelines. The system I built would not forgive amateurs, and I had all the time in the world. The first cut was so small they didn't even feel it. That was the point. I opened the clause late at night, one buried in a vendor contract I'd written 15 years earlier, during an oil price shock. The language was surgical, triggered only under conditions of material leadership transition, a phrase I'd crafted when I suspected a hostile takeover. No one ever noticed it because no one ever had to. Until now. I keyed in the command, sent the notice through a private channel, and leaned back as the domino fell. The vendor's shipments, critical components for our European division, would halt within 48 hours. On paper, it would look like a supply chain hiccup. To the press, it would be a footnote. To Claire, it would be a puzzle she couldn't solve. And to me, it was windage adjustment, one click left on the scope. I didn't take pleasure in the act. Pleasure is messy. This was discipline. I thought of it the way a surgeon thinks of the scalpel, controlled, exact, detached from blood. Betrayal burned beneath my ribs, but I didn't feed it. Rage clouds judgment. Precision cuts arteries. The next morning, I watched from my office as the numbers shifted. Cargo flagged as delayed a cascade of emails began. First quiet inquiries, then sharper tones. A German client called asking why their shipment hadn't cleared customs. By noon, 3 major partners were pressing for explanations. Claire issued a polished statement about logistical modernization. Her roommate followed with a press release heavy on buzzwords about redefining flow. Neither realized they were bleeding from the inside. I remembered the boardroom in 2009, when the financial crisis gutted markets and panic stalked every corner of the economy. Half the board wanted to cut staff by 30%. I said no. I locked myself in with them and laid out the numbers, showed them how loyalty wasn't charity, it was leverage. We tightened elsewhere, saved the workforce, and when the recovery came, our people repaid us in contracts and grit. That loyalty had carried Harrington Global through fire. Now it was dismissed as outdated thinking. I turned back to the screens. The supply chain was unraveling in increments too small for outsiders to catch. I triggered another cut. This one subtler. A penalty escalation on a transport contract in South America. The numbers shifted quietly, expenses rising like a tide, just high enough to soak the carpet. Claire didn't notice. She was too busy taking photos for a lifestyle magazine about the new face of global leadership. Her roommate smiled at the camera, his sneakers bright against marble floors. I watched them strut while the foundation trembled. Shareholders began to murmur, subtle at first, but murmurs grow teeth. Calls trickled in to the investor relations office. Why are delivery timelines slipping? What's causing the increased expenses? The answers came rehearsed, shallow, dressed in spin. Behind closed doors, managers were blamed, fired, replaced. None of them knew the fire started above their heads. Each move I made was deliberate. Cancel a contract here, delay a renewal there, whisper to an old contact that terms were shifting. Nothing explosive, nothing obvious, just small fractures accumulating in silence. I didn't need to destroy them in one blow. I needed them to feel the walls closing in inch by inch. Betrayal sharpened me. Every time I heard Claire's voice on a broadcast, dismissing the very projects that had kept us alive, the blade inside me honed finer. Every time I saw her roommate laugh off billion-dollar obligations as old-world hang-ups, the weight in my chest pressed harder. But I didn't let it out. I kept my breathing even, my hand steady. A sniper doesn't fire at movement. He fires at certainty. By the 3rd week, shipments froze in 2 more regions. Clients threatened to walk. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Claire stood in front of the cameras with a smile too wide and words too empty. Behind her, the numbers bled across the balance sheets. She blamed department heads, citing failure to adapt. Executives who had bled beside me in boardrooms were thrown under the bus, while she posed as the savior. And still, I waited. I could have pulled the plug on half the company with a single keystroke. I could have turned their empire into rubble overnight. But endings that sudden don't teach lessons. They only shock. I wanted inevitability. I wanted them to feel every ounce of weight they dismissed as the past. So I sat in the dark, screens flickering across my face, the city outside buzzing with blind optimism. I watched their empire stumble, one thread at a time, until the seams strained and the fabric groaned. My finger hovered over the next cut, the next silent severing. Not yet. The pressure wasn't high enough. Let them keep smiling. Let them keep selling their illusion. When the collapse came, it wouldn't be a surprise attack. It would be the realization that the knife had been inside them all along. The cracks became visible faster than even I had predicted. It started with whispers in industry circles, missed deliveries, key clients raising red flags, foreign partners hinting at withdrawal. At first, the news trickled out in trade journals and back-channel investor notes. Then the leaks grew louder, spilling into mainstream coverage. Phrases like operational instability and supply chain irregularities began to appear next to the company's name. What they didn't realize was that those whispers had been planted, fed carefully to the right ears by me. You don't need to scream to ruin someone. You only need to guide the rumor until it grows teeth of its own. Claire's empire, the one she'd built on magazine spreads and hashtags, began to wobble. She looked calm in public, always dressed for the cameras, but the footage betrayed her. Eyes darting in board meetings, hands too tight on the edge of the podium during investor calls, the nervous laugh she used when questions veered too close to the truth. Investors pressed harder. Why were foreign partners withdrawing? Why had two of our most dependable vendors terminated agreements simultaneously? Why were quarterly obligations suddenly unfulfilled? She gave them the only thing she knew: vibes. We are redefining the future, she said. Disruption always brings turbulence. Behind closed doors, panic took hold. Managers were summoned, interrogated, and fired. Whole departments reshuffled. She blamed middle management, compliance officers, even longtime board allies. One by one, people were cast out to preserve her illusion of control. The more she clawed, the weaker she looked. From my vantage point, it was like watching a wounded animal thrash against its own trap. I sat in my office, screens aglow, calm as a surgeon. Numbers scrolled in neat columns, stock price dipping, liquidity squeezed, penalties compounding. I could hear the echo of her father's voice in my head, the old man who had built Harrington Global on grit and iron. Never panic in public, he told me once during a recession. If you're bleeding, hide it until you've stitched yourself shut. His daughter had learned nothing of that. She bled openly, spraying panic across every call, every interview, until even her defenders began to doubt her. I made my next move subtle but decisive. One file, tucked into an anonymous envelope, arrived at the desk of a financial journalist I trusted. It wasn't the full arsenal, just a glimpse. Internal forecasts, doctored and inflated, signed off by Claire herself and her ever-present chief vibes officer. The numbers showed growth where there was decline, strength where there was only erosion. A fabricated future sold to shareholders as fact. When the article ran 2 days later, the effect was immediate. Headlines blared about misrepresentation. The board demanded answers. Investors screamed. Claire responded with polished outrage. She called the article a smear, blamed outdated executives resistant to change, and promised a new era of transparency. But denial never outruns proof. I had more: emails, edits, draft decks rewritten with false figures. Each piece of evidence sat neatly in my files, timed for release like charges set along a fault line. She began working 16-hour days, or at least pretending to. Her roommate shadowed her like a nervous ghost, throwing around phrases like market synergy and adaptive resonance, while sweat soaked his collar. She fired the CFO, then the compliance director. She reshuffled the board committee overseeing audits, replacing veterans with loyalists barely out of business school. The more she moved, the more obvious the rot became. It wasn't contained. It was her. I stayed silent. I didn't call anyone, didn't rush the process. I simply let the evidence speak, one leak at a time. Watching her was like watching a fighter in the late rounds, every punch wild, every breath shallow, feet stumbling on legs too heavy to lift. The audience could see it. The knockout was inevitable. Still, I didn't strike. Not yet. Timing is everything. The company was dangling on the edge of ruin, its once stable foundation shredded by arrogance and lies. One final mechanism waited in my hand, the keystone that would make the entire structure collapse. A full dossier of falsified forecasts, doctored reports, and signed approvals, ready to be placed directly in the board's lap. I stared at the file on my desk, the weight of it heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried. One word from me, and Harrington Global's facade would implode in hours. But I held it back, letting the tension stretch tighter and tighter. The chaos was still building, the fear still spreading. The cut had to be precise, undeniable, and final. Tomorrow the trap would snap shut. I released everything in one breath. The files, the contracts, the doctored forecasts, the recordings of closed-door promises. All of it cascaded out like a dam bursting. Regulators got the full dossier. Journalists received curated leaks with timestamps and signatures, too clean to deny. Shareholders saw the raw numbers stripped of polish, the ugly truth that their visionary CEO had sold them a dream, built entirely on lies. I didn't hide my fingerprints. I wanted them to know this wasn't an accident. It was judgment. The reaction was instantaneous. The stock collapsed before the opening bell finished ringing. Calls from foreign partners confirmed what I had already set in motion. Suspensions, withdrawals, lawsuits lined up like dominoes. Investors pulled out, not cautiously, but with the frantic urgency of people fleeing a burning building. In less than 72 hours, Harrington Global went from glossy magazine covers to front-page scandal. Every headline carried her name, not the company's, not her father's legacy, hers. I watched the empire unravel from the quiet of my office. There was no triumph in me, only a steady hum, like a long-held breath finally exhaled. She had believed power was a stage, that control was image and confidence. But markets don't worship charisma. Contracts don't bend for smiles. The walls fell in around her because I handed everyone the flashlight and showed them what was rotting in the corners. Her father, the man who had once ruled with iron steadiness, turned his back publicly. A single statement delivered through his attorneys. The board's confidence has been breached beyond repair. Effective immediately, I withdraw my support for the current leadership. No sentiment, no rescue, just exile. The roommate, the so-called chief vibes officer, vanished in the night, resigning with a note that blamed creative differences. His sneakers didn't even squeak against the marble floors as he ran. By the 5th day, lawsuits stacked higher than quarterly reports ever had. Clients demanded compensation. Shareholders demanded blood. And she, the woman who had once dismissed me with the flick of a wrist, was left alone in the carcass of her kingdom. I knew she would come looking for me. Pride has gravity. It was evening when I walked through the marble lobby of the tower for the last time. The building felt gutted, empty, its once busy atrium echoing with the hollow sound of abandonment. Security lights hummed. The air carried the faint smell of dust and burnt coffee. That's when I heard her heels striking against the floor, sharp, fast, desperate. She appeared at the base of the stairwell, hair disheveled, eyes wild with sleeplessness. Her voice cracked when she screamed across the expanse of the lobby. "You ruined me!" I didn't move at first. I let the words hang in the emptiness, her accusation bouncing off glass and steel. Then I turned, met her eyes, and spoke as calmly as if we were discussing quarterly projections. "No, you ruined yourself. I just turned on the lights." Her face twisted, part fury, part disbelief. For the first time since she'd inherited her father's empire, there was no audience to shield her, no boardroom full of nodding sycophants. Just me, the man she thought she'd discarded, standing unshaken in the ruins she had made. She tried to step closer, but the sound of approaching boots stopped her. Two security officers emerged from the shadows, federal badges clipped to their belts. They didn't address me. They didn't need to. Their eyes were locked on her. She struggled when they cuffed her, shouting about conspiracies, about betrayal, about visions too bold for the world to understand. But the words rang hollow, swallowed by the same silence she had once mocked. Her wrists clicked into steel, her voice cracked, and then she was dragged past me toward the waiting cars outside. She didn't look back. I stood there alone in the cavernous lobby, the empire gone, the illusion shattered. No sequel lingered, no loose ends dangled in the shadows. Harrington Global had been gutted, its false queen dethroned, its name etched in scandal. The gavel had fallen, and there was nothing left to argue. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase and walked toward the revolving doors. The city night pressed against the glass, alive and indifferent, just as it had been the day I left, with silence in my throat and betrayal burning in my chest. Now the silence remained, but the weight had shifted. Not rage, not sorrow, just closure. And as the doors spun me out into the cold air, I realized that endings don't always roar. Sometimes they echo like a final verdict, sharp and undeniable. This was mine. The case was closed.